lot of you live in Grangeville. And we're very honored again tonight to have Colleen Mahoney with us from the State Board of Education. And for a change, she did not take the only seat in the House, right? Steve, and it's especially fun, I think, though, to really see some Native Americans during Native American Awareness Week. And I want to remind you that the powwow, Dances with Welch, is on right after this. Hey, that's bad. Lois Welch made that up, and I stole it, and could have been good. Some of you, too, like Tim Nitz, were here last night, so you're going to hear the same sorry, tired little, but sincere speech, Sue Armitage, that you heard last night. And again, I'd like to thank Ripley Shem for hosting Mr. Welch and getting a bed for Lois and Jim to sleep on. And the furniture store owner is here tonight, too. Thank you for that. I do want to mention just a few things for visitors. Geez, the whole Grangeville crowd is here. It's amazing. It's embarrassing. Jim Welch published his first book in 1971. It was a book of poems, which has been reprinted. And then about 3 years later, he published Winter in the Blood, which I think is still one of the finest novels, especially for a first novel, anyone has ever done. Fool's Crow is probably my favorite of his novels because we were talking a little bit, and God, look, Vice President Soika is here. His wife. Now, we know this is an important event. No, just kidding. The reason I mentioned Fool's Crow is because it's probably the most ambitious novel ever written by a Native American, and maybe much more than that. And when I was growing up on the reservation, there was a term, and I mentioned this to Jim last night, and the term was not a good term. Although sometimes when people told me that, I felt flattered. But the term was thinking like an Indian, and it was a negative term. Simon Ortiz just wrote me yesterday, and he's a Native American guy, and he sort of explains it a little bit. He is in need of an agent. I've recently decided not to be an agent for anybody anymore, and we were talking about that, and he had a bad experience, and he says, I was thinking like an Indian, I realize now, meaning being negative about myself in terms of presumed image, internalized stereotype, and so-called lack of qualification. It's been a big issue with me, at times an unmanageable burden problem, as it has been for many, many Native Americans. We don't have to see ourselves as negative images. We are real people with real intellect, real creativity, real qualifications, and real initiative. Well, at that time, way back when, I didn't know this, or I was just finding out and trying to articulate it as best I could. And but for me, see, when they said, "Oh, Hepworth, you're thinking like an Indian," that was a big compliment. That was pretty good for me. I was very moved watching Jim on television last night. I went out. By the way, we don't have to worry about that tonight. But last night there were not enough places to sit, so I went and watched it on television. And he read this incredible piece about basketball. And as a coach's son, that was very moving to me. One of the things I think that Jim does, and other writers too, like Mary Blue, I get this experience reading her fiction. But when we read a novel like Indian Lawyer, and for me at least, the regional part, the part that's local, makes the landscape come alive in a way that it creates history. And I think, you know, I was asking Jim about it. Edward Hoagland wrote a review of Indian Lawyer, and he says, Mr. Welch deserves to be much more widely known than he is. You know, his work will probably be taken as, quote, regional. But for me, that's the real high point, is that Browning, where Chris Ashby, our librarian, taught for a year, is in a book. And the character of Lena Oldhorn is the counselor there, and she's Crow. And so there's a problem, and the problem is dealt with genuinely and authentically. At any rate, I was waiting for a few stragglers, as you could tell, and they're here now. And so because Jim needs no introduction and we're all gathered, it is my great and distinguished pleasure now to reintroduce you to James Welch.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Jim, for a lovely introduction. Tonight I'm coming at this Indian business from the other side. I'm writing a documentary film on Custer, and it's a very interesting experience. I'm doing a lot of research, and in doing the research, I've come to understand more about Custer than I thought I wanted to know. And maybe what I say tonight will be more than you want to know. But it is interesting to try to come to terms with the myth of Custer. And as you'll see in this little paper I'm going to read, that's the whole focus of this film. It'll deal with his life, it'll deal with the Little Bighorn, it'll deal with the Indian people, the opposition. In a way, I think that probably hasn't been dealt with before. I think it'll be a more balanced view. One thing about doing a documentary is that you can do pretty much what you want. You're not limited by dramatic terms. And so we're having a great deal of fun doing the research, this filmmaker and I. And then eventually there will be a book. I just am in the process of making arrangements to write a book about this. So I hope tonight that this piece will maybe make you think a little bit more about the Custer legend, the Custer myth. Not only as it's perceived by society at large, but by the Indian population too. This talk is called The Last Stand, which is incidentally the title of the documentary film, which will be shown as part of the American Experience series on PBS, I think a year from this coming fall. In early July last summer, I received a phone call from a young man from Boston. He introduced himself as Paul Stegner, a documentary filmmaker, and he wondered if I had a few minutes to listen to a film idea he had in mind. As a writer, I get quite a few phone calls of this nature. Somebody has a bright idea on how to make a film of one of my novels, or a film based on a novel, or an original film project based on Indians or Big Sky Country. And I listen patiently, occasionally hopefully, most often skeptically. I've learned to wait for the shoe to drop, and drop it does. They don't actually have any money yet. They would like to tie up one of my books for next to nothing. One filmmaker who actually had some success in Hollywood as a writer and director proposed that I option Winter in the Blood to him for $10. Just to get the unsavory financial business out of the way. Then we could really get down to the aesthetics of the film. Or they want me to commit myself to the project so they can use my name in their fundraising efforts. It always astounds me that these people think my name is going to have much of an effect on a Hollywood mogul or a bunch of hard-nosed film people on a panel of the National Endowment for the Arts or Humanities. There are hundreds and thousands of filmmakers at varying degrees of proficiency trying to pry money out of these heartless bastards, and only a handful are successful. I recently met a filmmaker who is also a cinematographer. As a cameraman, he travels 180 days out of the year, filming one project after another. He has won 2 Emmys, been nominated for an Academy Award, and won a prestigious MacArthur Foundation Award. As a filmmaker, he made a documentary on Yosemite National Park that is the standard by which all such documentaries are judged. He has 3 current projects going, and he can't find funding for any of them. So as I listened to Paul Stegner describe his idea, I listened with an unhealthy but justified dose of cynicism. It didn't help that he sounded so young and enthusiastic, that he wanted to provide a more balanced account of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, that he wanted to bring in the social and economic issues of the period, that he wanted to present the Indians as defenders of their homeland, of their families, of their culture, that he wanted to deal with the Custer myth in a way that hadn't been examined before in films. That is, as a national myth that just won't go away. In fact, it gets stronger as the event of the Little Bighorn fades further and further into the past. He wanted to ask why in this film, and he wanted to present some possible answers. Then he said 2 things that perked my interest. One, he had the money. He had been funded by WGBH, the public television station in Boston, to do the film as part of its American Experience series. And 2, he said, do you remember when you first heard about Custer's last stand? Do you remember the circumstances? He was just curious, he said. He had been posing that set of questions to his friends and acquaintances around the country. Of course, he didn't need to ask the primary triggering question, does the name Custer ring a bell? Everybody in his country, I believe, would have had his or her bell rung. But what about other countries, European countries, Latin American countries, African countries, the Middle East, the Far East, Russia, Albania? Toward the end of the war with Iraq, when we were about to send in our ground forces, a CNN reporter referred to the Republican Guard as Saddam's last stand. He saw no need to elaborate on that phrase. And mind you, CNN was broadcasting the war all over the world. My wife and I have a couple of friends who were traveling throughout Southeast Asia at the time, and they kept abreast of the war through CNN in bars and restaurants. And of course, General Schwarzkopf, in responding to the question of a premature invasion of Iraq, declared, "I'm no Custer." I would like to make another point in a roundabout way in support of my contention that the recognition of Custer is worldwide. Our government, our administration in particular, has risen periodically in self-righteous anger at the atrocities committed by other governments against their people. We condemn brutality, torture, murder, the extermination of a group of that country's inhabitants. These acts are usually committed in the name of politics or cultural or religious differences, and they deserve to be condemned by the country, the United States, which considers itself the beacon of the free world. The response of the leaders of these unenlightened countries is universally the same. What about the way you've treated your own minorities? Didn't you try to exterminate the Indians, the original inhabitants of your country? It is not stretching the point much to assume that these people know that Custer is the symbol of that extermination policy. Would it surprise you to learn that Custer's last stand, more properly the Battle of the Little Bighorn, is the single most reproduced event in American history? Those 2 to 3 hot, dusty hours on June 25th, 1876, have inspired over 1,000 paintings and illustrations and have been the subject of more than 40 Hollywood movies. Depending on how old we are or how interested we are in the history of the movies, we have probably all seen one or more of these films. The 2 most popular of them are They Died with Their Boots On, which was made on the eve of World War II and starred Errol Flynn as Custer and Anthony Quinn as Crazy Horse. And Little Big Man, which was made in 1970 and starred Dustin Hoffman as Jack Crabb, the old Indian fighter, and Richard Mulligan, a comic actor, as Custer. Then there was D.W. Griffith's Custer film, a silent movie made in 1913 called The Massacre. He made this even before Birth of a Nation. In it, he shows Custer defending women and children on Last Stand Hill. And even before that pioneer showman, Buffalo Bill, made a film, or at least footage exists, at the reenactment of the battle in his Wild West show. It might have been called Custer Dies a Thousand Deaths, because he died nightly in the Wild West show. One thing that struck me in thinking about these films is how each of them reflected the national mood at the time it was made. The title of the Griffith film, The Massacre, explains better than I can what people thought of the last stand scarcely 37 years after the event. Most of the citizens who were alive at the time of the battle were still alive when this movie came out, and they apparently still held a grudge against the Indians. Never mind the fact that the 7th Cavalry charged the Indian village, Custer fully expecting a glorious victory. The Indians massacred Custer and his troops. As I mentioned earlier, They Died with Their Boots On was made in 1941, on the eve of World War II, and the mood was intensely patriotic. Custer was depicted as a brash, reckless, headstrong scamp, full of mischief but brave when the chips were down. After a brilliant Civil War career, during which he had as many as 10 horses shot out from under him, and lost more men than any other commander in the Union Army, he turned his attentions to fighting Indians on the frontier. Well, after a much acclaimed victory against the Southern Cheyennes on the Washita River in the Indian Territories, now Oklahoma, he headed north, where he eventually bought it on the Little Bighorn. In the grand manner, Errol Flynn, Custer, fought to the last man, in fact was the last man. Saber in one hand, the American flag in the other, he is ridden down and shot by Anthony Quinn, Crazy Horse. Never mind the fact that Crazy Horse most definitely did not kill Custer, or that Custer was not the last man killed. It was a film that made America want to go to war. An interesting side note here, Ronald Reagan took his turn playing Custer in the 1940 film Santa Fe Trail. I don't recall anything very interesting here. In 1970, the mood of the country had changed from blind patriotism to a national self-doubt. We were Mike Tyson, all right, but we had met Buster Douglas in Vietnam. Many in the country felt that we had no business being there or any place else beyond the borders of the United States. We are not the world's policeman. We are the world's bully. Little Big Man reflected that mood. Custer is portrayed as a vicious, deranged, vainglorious bully, slaughtering innocent Indians in their winter villages, much like the soldiers in Vietnam committed atrocities. Who can forget My Lai? Who can forget the air of moral and racial superiority in the atmosphere of this country when we first went into Vietnam? Little Big Man was a huge success as a film, in no small part due to the portrayal of Custer as a deranged buffoon. Never mind the fact that Custer was most definitely not a deranged buffoon, given to uttering, "Never question a Custer decision." You've probably already determined by my never mind the fact terminology that all these films were terribly inaccurate, unashamedly inaccurate. Whether for commercial purposes or ideological purposes, these filmmakers played to their audiences, and they weren't about to let a few facts stand in the way. As the man says in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, "This is the West, sir. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend. Of course, the Custer myth began a long time before the Battle of the Little Bighorn. As a child, his beauty was remarked on by all the women folk. One Sarah McFarland said, "What a pretty girl he would have made." This was when he was 16. And he was doted on and waited on and looked upon as a remarkable youth, despite a lack of real accomplishments. And when he got to West Point, he distinguished himself mostly by his demerits. Late for parade, talking on parade, face unshaven, hair unkempt, equipment dirty, uniform disordered, shoes unpolished, slackness in drill, failure to salute a superior, sitting down on sentry duty, room out of order, gambling in quarters, tobacco smoke in quarters, late for class, etc. When he graduated, he was 34th in a class of 34. Nevertheless, he was well liked by his fellow cadets, which was very good for his career, as many of them were from socially prominent, wealthy families, including a Vanderbilt and a DuPont. Custer was a social climber then, and especially later in life, in his Civil War days and frontier period. In fact, he would attempt to defraud some of these friends later by fronting a phony silver mine in Colorado, which attempted to sell stock to them, as well as several other prominent financiers. Custer spent most of his life reaching for wealth and social prominence. He always tried to be on the right side, to curry favor with whichever side was in the ascendancy. But he did have qualities which impressed his superiors in the Civil War. His reckless bravery earned him a battlefield promotion to Major General. He was the youngest man ever to receive such a rank, and he became known as the Boy General. The Boy General with his flowing yellow curls, a New York Herald reporter called him. Custer's instinct to charge the enemy against whatever odds, and his success in this tactic, won the admiration of the Union, which was desperately seeking heroes in this catastrophic war. Custer himself was impressed with himself. As he wrote home to his wife Libby, "Oh, could you but have seen some of the charges that were made. While thinking of them, I cannot help but exclaim, 'Glorious war.'" It was during this period of his career that the Custer myth came into existence. Sketches of him in action appeared in the popular magazines, while such newspapers as the New York Times hailed him as a young Napoleon. Just prior to the 1864 presidential elections, when Lincoln needed proof that the war was going well, Custer rode into Washington with all the Confederate flags captured in the Shenandoah Valley to present to the War Department. Old soldiers kissed his hand, and his superiors were as proud of him as if he were their own flesh and blood. A reporter wrote, "The embarrassed looks of General Custer as he bowed his thanks showed that his modesty was equal to his courage." When Lee surrendered at Appomattox, Custer personally received his white flag. And finally, on May 23, 1865, the Army of the Potomac held its grand review in Washington, a spectacular parade, a victory celebration, with Major General George Armstrong Custer at the head. As luck would have it, Custer's horse bolted as he leaned over to catch a bouquet thrown by a young girl. The horse stampeded down the parade route. Custer lost his saber and hat while trying to salute, but in a marvelous display of riding, brought the errant horse under control right in front of the president. The crowd cheered. You can see that the Custer myth preceded the Little Bighorn by a good number of years. Unfortunately for the Boy General, many of those years between the end of the Civil War and the Northern Plains period were troubled years. He got into some trouble in Texas for sympathizing with Southerners, and in one case for shooting a deserter. Later he'd get into more trouble for shooting deserters. And he also lost his rank as Major General, being reduced to captain in the regular army. His salary went from $8,000 to $2,000 a year. In spite of his fame, Custer always had money troubles. Libby Custer, truly a remarkable woman in her own right, bought a new wardrobe during a gay time in New Orleans, then went to Texas with George. When she returned a year later, her dresses were out of fashion, so she had to replace the virtually unworn finery. But Custer and Libby continued to make a grand impression on high society. They spent an unusually large amount of time in Washington and New York, going to parties and plays, making contacts. During this time, Custer was offered a diplomatic post, several jobs with financial firms, and a congressional nomination from Michigan. As a Civil War hero, the world lay at his feet. But he preferred to stay in the Army in the hopes that a higher command would open up. In fact, he scorned politics. Contrary to popular belief, it is not true that he raced to the Little Bighorn in order to win a big victory, then get back to Washington in time to accept the Democratic bid for the presidency. The political scene during that post-war period was a mess. Reconstruction of the South was in a shambles. The country was turning from an agrarian society to an industrial one, and strikes were crippling those industries. President Grant's peace policy, or Quaker policy, regarding the Indians was beset by scandal and corruption almost as it was being formulated. It is this peace policy that concerns us here, for it eventually affected Custer in a big way. Custer's arrival on the Northern Plains in 1867 coincided with the worst period of the Indian problem. The railroads were anxious to push through to the west. Travelers on the Bozeman Trail to the Montana goldfields were being attacked by Red Cloud and his Sioux and Cheyenne. Fetterman and his troops had been massacred, and the public was in full cry. As General Sherman, the commander of the armies, wrote, "I expect to have 2 Indian wars on my hands. The Sioux and Cheyennes are now so circumscribed that I suppose they must be exterminated, for they cannot and will not settle down, and our people will force us to do it." The peace policy was simple: to Christianize the Indians and to change their way of life so they would be content to lead an agrarian life in prescribed territories. Each reservation would be handed over to different denominations, and these Christians, as well as government agents, would oversee the transition of the Indians into peaceful, non-nomadic farmers. It was the intent of this policy to promote an assimilation into the larger culture by creating a situation in which the Indians would abandon the notion of tribe. Of course, the policy was doomed to failure. Even if the Indians had agreed to such a concept, and some of them had, there were other forces that made it impossible. As Richard Slotkin, the noted cultural historian, puts it, Indians occupied lands that were desired by expanding railroads, land-hungry farmers, speculators, and miners, and from these came an unremitting pressure for extinction of their land titles, reduction of reservations, and even extermination of the Indians themselves. Custer himself has ambivalent feelings about the Indians. On the one hand, he sympathizes with them, even identifies with them as free spirits on the plains. He writes, "If I were an Indian, I often think that I would greatly prefer to cast my lot among those of my people who adhered to the free, open plains, rather than submit to the confined limits of a reservation, there to be the recipient of the blessed benefits of civilization, with its vices thrown in without stint or measure." On the other hand, he could write about the Indian this way: "Nature intended him for a savage state. Every instinct, every impulse of his soul inclines him to it. The white race might fall into a barbarous state, and afterwards subjected to the influence of civilization, be reclaimed and prosper. Not so for the Indian. He cannot be himself and be civilized. He fades away and dies. Cultivation such as the white man would give him deprives him of his identity. Education, strange as it may appear, seems to weaken rather than strengthen his intellect. Maybe the portrayal of Custer in Little Big Man wasn't so far off. Unfortunately for the Army, it wasn't so easy to engage the Indians. Even while the peace policy was the official policy of the Grant administration, the Army continued to attempt to provoke an Indian war. Because the Indians were very good at hit-and-run tactics. They were so good, in fact, that the government in the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 agreed to close down the forts along the Bozeman Trail, not only because the Sioux and Cheyenne wanted them out of their territory, but because they couldn't even protect the forts and soldiers, much less the citizenry on the trail. The Fort Laramie Treaty, in very simple terms, created a large reservation called the Great Sioux Reservation, which took in all of the western half of present-day South Dakota, including the Black Hills. It also provided for a vast hunting ground which extended into Montana. As Black Elk remembers, it would be ours for as long as grass should grow and water flow. In exchange, the Sioux and Cheyenne were to live on the reservation, give up the nomadic buffalo hunting life, learn to farm, and most importantly, allow the white settlers to pass through their former territories unharmed. I forgot to mention earlier that even before the Civil War, the whites outnumbered the Indians on the plains by a 10-to-1 margin, which led to inevitable conflicts from the very beginning. I think most of us have the misconception that during the frontier period, the white settlers were overwhelmed by a massive number of Indians. Two names emerge at this point in this narrative, Chief Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. Sitting Bull was a Hunkpapa Sioux and as close to a general overall leader of a tribe of Indians as possible among Indians. Tribal groups on the plains did not really have a concept of an all-powerful chief who made the decisions and dictated policy and administered orders. He could simply demonstrate through his wisdom and courage and example that he was a man to be listened to, not necessarily obeyed. Sitting Bull did not recognize the boundaries of the Great Reservation and always lived away from it. As he told the reservation Indians, "I don't want to have anything to do with people who make one carry water on the shoulders and haul manure. The whites may get me at last, but I will have good times till then. You are fools to make yourselves slaves to a piece of fat bacon, some hardtack, and a little sugar and coffee." A few years later, after Custer's death at the Little Bighorn, Sitting Bull was to play the prominent role in the Eastern press as the fiendish agent of Custer's destruction. As Slotkin puts it, there is an attractive symmetry in the opposition of two exemplary protagonists, dark and light, fiend and hero. And the New York Herald, moved by both kinds of appeal, proceeds to make Sitting Bull a dark counterpoint of its own hero. Thus Sitting Bull contributes darkly to the Custer myth. Crazy Horse was an Oglala Sioux and 9 years younger than Sitting Bull. Although at an early age he established himself as a brave leader through example, he was a loner and frequently lived by himself for long periods of time. During those self-exiles, he prayed to the Great Spirit and thought about many things, including military tactics. He realized that the Indian way of conducting warfare through light skirmishes, collecting individual honors, then scattering, was foolish when confronting the white military. A close friend, He Dog, remembers, All the time I was in fights with Crazy Horse. In critical moments, Crazy Horse would always jump off his horse to fire. He is the only Indian I ever knew who did that often. He wanted to be sure that he hit what he aimed at. And he didn't like to start a battle unless he had it all planned out in his head and knew he was going to win. Another seemingly extraneous point should be made here. By the late 1860s and early 70s, the buffalo were being slaughtered by the millions by white hide hunters and sportsmen, as well as the Indians. General Sheridan, commander of the Western Army, wrote that the buffalo hunters have done more to settle the vexed Indian question than the entire regular army has done in the last 30 years. They are destroying the Indian commissary. By 1873, America was reeling from the Great Panic, the stock market crash, the worst depression in the country's history, massive unemployment, more strikes, and a drastic cut in the business of the intercontinental railroads. The Northern Pacific Railroad faced bankruptcy, and both they and the newly completed Northern Union Pacific desperately needed settlers to sell their land grants to. They turned to the Black Hills. There had been rumor of gold, and these railroad moguls reasoned that the Great Sioux Reservation must be opened up for settlement to encourage settlers to move west with impunity. They had little difficulty in selling the idea to the government. Grant's peace policy was in a shambles. Grant's own brother had been charged with corruption as an Indian agent, and there was no more pretense of allowing the Indians to live peacefully on their land. In 1874, an expedition was undertaken by the Army into the Black Hills under the guise of science to survey the hills for whatever resources they contained. It was to be led by George Armstrong Custer, the media darling, and it was as flamboyant as he was. There were over 1,000 men, over 100 wagons. Every morning, Custer's 16-piece cavalry band serenaded the marching column for 2 or 3 miles, leading with his favorite song, Gary Owen. A pack of reporters came along, as did President Grant's son, Fred, who was reportedly drunk for most of the expedition. Grant didn't have very good relatives. At dusk after each day's march, the soldiers played a popular new game called baseball, and they discovered gold. The Eastern press trumpeted the triumph of the expedition. They called the Black Hills paradise on earth. They spoke of magical valleys, of flowers so high they grazed the horses' bellies. They cited gold nuggets clinging to the roots of overturned trees. And the rush was on. Within 1 year, there were 11,000 miners in the hills. By the next year, they numbered 25,000 and still coming. The Sioux were outraged. They called Custer the chief of the thieves, and his trail to the hills the thieves' trail. At first, the government made a half-hearted attempt to prevent the gold rush, but that failed miserably. Next, it tried to buy the Black Hills. Some of the peaceful Indians, recognizing now that it was futile to fight the United States Army, were willing to consider a settlement. But the non-reservation Indians, including Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, were repelled by the idea. Sitting Bull proposed that the Indians get a scale and sell the sacred earth by the pound. Eventually, the reservation chiefs offered the Black Hills for $70 million, more than 10 times what the government offered. Grant refused. War now seemed inevitable. Assessing the chance of war, one general remarked, "It must come someday, and why postpone it any longer to favor a people who are practically and professedly assassins and nothing but assassins?" In early December 1875, Grant ordered all Indians onto the reservations by the end of January. Runners from the agency conveyed the order to the scattered tribes, the so-called roamers. Most, including Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, refused to comply, and the Indian War had begun. During the rest of that winter, the agency Indians thought about and discussed their chances of survival when the war occurred. They remembered the massacres at Sand Creek and Washita. When the Army could not find the hostile Indians, they would begin to punish the friendly Indians, as had happened in both instances. And two, the appeal to visit the Buffalo Ranges, to live the old way one last time, was compelling. So these friendlies began to leave the reservation in the spring in great numbers. Oglalas, Blackfeet, Sanzark, Miniconjou, Hunkpapas, Cheyenne, and others converged on the Powder River region in Montana, bringing their horses and guns. The Army's spring campaign of 1876 was relatively simple. They planned a pincher campaign with 3 cavalry columns marching toward the Powder River region from the east, west, and south. Supremely confident, the officers vied for the opportunity to be in on the kill, to defeat the last hostiles on the northern plains. It was clear that no one believed the Sioux and Cheyenne would put up much of a fight. Their greatest fear was that the Indians would slip away and escape. Custer, as usual, in and out of trouble with his superiors, in spite of his best efforts to curry favor, had survived a court-martial for leaving his post and personally killing deserting soldiers. No wonder he had earned the nicknames of Iron Butt, Hard Ass, and Ringlets. I like the one Ringlets. Is this still going, or am I? Okay, I'll just keep going, I guess. I do have a bit of a cold, so I didn't want to yell. This time he had earned such disfavor with Grant that the President personally relieved him of his command of the 7th Cavalry. It was only through the intercession of Sherman and Sheridan that Custer was permitted to assume command of the 7th in time to go to the Little Bighorn. On May 17, Custer's 7th Cavalry marched out of Fort Abe Lincoln, Bismarck, Dakota Territory. As the wives waved goodbye, the regimental band played "The Girl I Left Behind Me." The rest is history, as they say, but with a twist. History on its way to becoming myth. Custer drove his troops hard through torrential downpours, a freak June snowstorm, and weeks of unrelenting heat. The trooper's life was dull at best, at worst, terrifyingly violent. The pay was low, the discipline harsh, the food inedible. Past desertion rates approached 50%. Nearly 10% of the Army's new recruits committed suicide each year. Many of these troopers, new immigrants, had enlisted to escape the desperation and unemployment of the cities. Nearly half the men with Custer were foreign-born. Some could barely speak English. They were Irish and German, northern farm boys and Russians, an Italian count who had escaped from Devil's Island, and a former slave who had fled Louisiana. Not too many days before the Battle of the Little Bighorn, the Sioux and their allies held a sun dance on the Rosebud. During the dance, Sitting Bull had a vision of soldiers without ears falling upside down into camp. Soon after, a large force of Sioux and Cheyenne under Crazy Horse rode south, defeating General Crook's southern column on the Rosebud River. Their intensity and persistence shocked Crook. He retreated. Many historians believe that the Battle of the Rosebud and Crook's subsequent withdrawal contributed mightily to Custer's defeat. On the morning of June 25th, Custer divided his regiment into three forces. The first, under Captain Frederick Benteen, rode west to cut off escape routes. A second, led by Major Marcus Reno, rode straight toward the village. Custer and his company of 212 men rode above the river bluffs and prepared a flanking attack. Before they descended to the river for their final charge, the Crow scouts tossed aside their army jackets and began singing Indian war songs. One scout looked at Custer and said, "Tell him that today he, myself, and the others are going to be killed. I'm going to the happy hunting grounds as an Indian." Custer derisively dismissed their superstitions, telling the scouts they had done their job and could leave. As the group moved off, Custer's interpreter looked back at the scouts and said, "You are lucky. Just leave right now. Don't stick around. We're going to be killed in a little while." Custer's last recorded words were, "We've caught them napping." I won't go into the details of the battle. Many of you are familiar with the particulars, but it seems clear that Major Reno attacked the Indian encampment at 3:10 p.m., and Custer and his forces, who were engaged in a flanking action, lay dead on the battlefield by 5:20 p.m. Custer's engagement apparently lasted about an hour and a half, or as the Cheyenne war chief Two Moon said, about as long as it takes for a hungry man to eat his dinner. We circled all around them, swirling like water around a stone. Estimates put the Indian camp at 10,000 strong, nearly 2,000 of these capable fighters. None of the warriors realized that they were fighting Custer, or Longhair as they called him. On this day his hair was clipped short. That night the Indians mourned their own dead and celebrated their victory. And hundreds of miles away, the wives of the 7th Cavalry officers gathered together, seeking solace to sing hymns. Unaware of her husband's fate, Libby Custer wrote, "At that very hour, the fears that our tormented minds had portrayed in imagination were realities, and the souls of those we thought upon were ascending to meet their Maker." Reno and Benteen and their men fought on for another day, before the Indians broke camp and moved south to the Bighorn Mountains, there to scatter in all directions in search of game and rest. Within a year, harried, cold, hungry, and sick of fighting, most were on reservations. Sitting Bull and his followers had fled to Canada. Crazy Horse was killed at Fort Robinson the next spring. The Indian War was over. Today the battle site is called Custer Battlefield National Monument, the only battlefield monument named for the loser. As a matter of fact, there's legislation, as you all know, I'm sure, to change the name to the Little Bighorn National Monument and to erect a permanent and official monument to the Indians who fought there. What of the Custer myth? Some scholars, such as historian Brian Dippy, argue that myths such as Custer's Last Stand appeal to a universal archetypal myth-making need. Each nation or tribe has an equivalent myth of a martyred hero, from the Song of Roland to the death of Arthur, from the struggle of the Spartans against the Persians at Thermopylae to the death of Davy Crockett at the Alamo. Others, such as Richard Slotkin, argue that myths arise from very specific socio-economic and historical circumstances, that they are invented by a society during moments of crisis to explain away its conflicts and ambiguities. How does Custer's Last Stand emerge as a historical myth? Some see his battle as representing moral triumph in a time of corruption, that some of the old values, a sense of duty, love of country, courage, and self-sacrificing heroism had survived a century of change. Don't forget 1876 was the centennial year for this country. In fact, the nation's readers learned about Custer's death 2 days after the 4th of July opening of the Philadelphia Exposition, an exhibition of American progress in the industrial age. Others see Custer's defeat as a reversal of the ideal American scenario. Red stood and white fell. Civilization perished and savagery went forward. Custer's example was used to summon his fellow citizens to the purgation of evil. In carrying on Custer's mission to open up a much-needed new frontier of gold and land, it was reasoned the youth and limitlessness of the American frontier could be reborn. Or, as the New York Herald wrote, long after this generation has passed away, long after this Yellowstone country has become the seat of towns and cities, the name of Custer and the story of his deeds will be fresh in men's memories. The story that comes to us today with so much horror, so much pathos, will become a part of our national life. To get back to the beginning of this talk, I had no answer to Paul Stegner's questions. Do you remember when you first heard about Custer's last stand? Do you remember the circumstances? I may have hemmed and hawed and said, probably I saw a movie, maybe up in Browning, Montana, on the Blackfeet Reservation, where I saw a lot of cowboy and Indian movies in my youth. But before we hung up the phone that day, I said, yes, I will work on the documentary movie with you. It'll be good. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah,